Ashley, welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to have you here.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. All right. So let's start off with you introducing yourself to the audience in case folks just haven't heard about you before.
Yes, I am Ashley. I founded a company called the Fiscal Femme really because I needed it myself. I studied finance, I worked in finance, still knew nothing about my own money. And when I went, and this was about in 2011, maybe 2010. And when I went to go figure it out, I found that a lot of the resources were kind of boring, daunting, written by older white men. And I thought, you know what? I can share this in a more fun, accessible, enjoyable way. It was actually a big challenge for me to I started a blog that was called The Fiscal Femme, sharing what I was learning on my own journey. And it was a big challenge to have a voice and have my words out on the internet. Like, what if I change my mind or grow or disagree with myself? And then from there, people started asking me for help. Other sites asked me to write for them. And the Fiscal Femme it grew very organically.
That's amazing. And I think it speaks to the power of just showing up, knowing that you have something to offer to the conversation and just not letting those imposter syndrome feelings start to get in the way and letting that stuff prevent you from doing what you got to do. So you are not the first person who has told me that they have a background in finance and feels like they did not learn any relevant shit that would actually help you manage your money as an adult. So what I've heard is like, you get taught about how to help a business financially grow. It's like the commercial side of finance, but it's not necessarily like how to budget, how to start investing. And so I think that's very interesting, very disturbing. Um, and says a lot about our general education system here in this country. So I'm curious, what was your original career plan? Like, did you want to become like a CFO, or what is it that made you pursue this career?
Yes, that's a really good question. So you're 100% right. We were talking about company finances. There was nothing ever talking about mine. And a lot of the company finances were like very large scale. Like there was lots of zeros. So very not relatable. Like maybe an income statement, I could relate to my budget or something. But um and I think what happened? I was in school studying finance. I I guess at the time being an investment banker was kind of like the hardest non-woman friendly career, and I wanna just prove I could do it. And so I went and I did my 2 years, and the lifestyle style was tough. Worked on average probably till midnight, ate dinners at our desks. I think the hardest part was that you could just be called back in at any time. And when I switched to a job that had a better lifestyle, I took a pay cut, and that was kind of the impetus to figure this all out because when I was working all the time and making a big salary, I didn't have to think about it. I was doing not a lot of smart things anyway, but it wasn't kind of confronting me until I took the pay cut, lived in New York City, had free time that I wanted to do all these fun things, and started to see, oh, this is completely not workable and I have to figure it out.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I can totally relate to the idea of just thinking that the way to make money is to work a lot.
Mm,
Um, and so I realized very early in my career as an engineer, I can't get paid enough to do shit that I don't like and that I'm not enjoying. And so that was when my kind of, plan to escape the rat race began. So I love that you decided, I need more balance in my life. And unfortunately, that can come with some trade offs. And for you, that was a pay cut. So you start this platform, the Fiscal Femme. What was the impetus for you to be like, I think I need to do this full time?
the impetus. So I had this lofty goal of building it on the side with my corporate finance job, and then once it was profitable and could pay me a nice salary, that's when I would quit. But that is not how it happened. In my corporate finance job, I ended up getting a promotion and they wanted me to, I was working as a CFO of one of their units, and they also wanted me to start underwriting surety bonds. And so I would have to go through this intensive training because I had no idea how to do that. And I realized that at that time I would have to either kind of go all in on this new role and put the Fiscal Femme aside or say bye. So, and for a while going into this, I had been saving up. I called it Project Freedom. So every dollar I saved, I tracked, and I tracked how much money I was losing every month if I paid myself. And okay, I could survive this many months. Um, and it was really motivating to put money away that way. To think about, oh, if I don't spend this, I can quit my job sooner. Um, and I do think something you mentioned, that you there's no amount of money someone can pay you to do things you don't want. I think it's as painful as it is. There's such a power to be able to experience that. I think a lot of people can look at a really high paying job and say, you know what, I will be happy because I'm making so much money. But to be able to experience it and realize that is not it, like that feeling, then you carry that with you, I think, for the rest of your career.
Yeah, absolutely. I was convinced, I just need a specific title, a specific employer, a specific amount of money in my paycheck, and I will be happy. And I promise y'all, not how it works. Okay. Not how it works. I think another thing that a lot of people don't know how it works is actually how to manage your freaking money. My lessons as a kid were like, go make a lot of it, period. That was the end of the lesson, not like, what do you do to make it grow? How can you stop working? How can you use money to do that? What investing is? None of that. And so I think the book that you are writing, and it's coming out very soon, it's called Financial Adulting. I think that's exactly what we should be talking about in this podcast and in the greater sphere of personal finance. So let's talk about the basics. When you, like, let's say you're going to explain what the hell financial adulting is to somebody on the street, what does it encompass?
So I think when we think about adulting and financial adulting, we might think that we know everything and we're not making any mistakes and we've got it going on. But the truth is I still make mistakes all the time. I'm learning all the time. It's a journey. And so being a financial adult is actually not as daunting as it sounds. It's about taking small, consistent action that leads to big results. I think that's really important. It's about just knowing where our money is going, which sounds very simple, but it's actually very profound because that it means how much is coming in, what's going out, what's going to our different goals. And as it can feel tedious to really nail that down, but it's so impactful and makes such a huge difference. And then it's having plans. And not only plans, really all they are ways that we're deciding to execute and achieve the goals that we want.
Yeah.
And so it's knowing what we want, and or having an idea, and that can adjust, and having plans. And then I think a really important part too of financial adulting, and it's something that you talk about so beautifully and include in the conversation, is that we have to also talk about equity and how we're not starting from the same place. And there's historical oppression and there's systemic barriers that people are experiencing. And so to say, I saved up and bought my home and not acknowledge all the privilege I have that allowed me to do that, I think it helps us to understand our privilege so that we could help close these gaps. And then also understand if we're at disadvantages so that we can have some compassion and not be comparing ourselves with others when it's there's no comparison.
Yeah, that's such an important note, and I think that's a perspective that is missing still from a lot of the general personal finance stuff. It's just the acknowledgement of the privilege, the acknowledgement of the systemic barriers that folks have, and just a more inclusive voice. So I love that you're factoring that in as well. Okay, so we get all types of things that we should be doing thrown at us on the
Mm,
daily by the personal finance community, right? You should be budgeting, saving, investing, building an emergency fund, saving to buy a house, getting insurance, writing a will and an estate plan. And it's just like, oh my God, it's all too much. Where do we start?
yes. So that's a really good question. And like all those the shoulds, they could just eat you alive. And that's why I think the small, consistent steps are so important. There are like I can talk about some generally recommended order of priority, but also it's taking an action. So if there's something that you're already interested in doing, or it kind of is something you're excited about doing, and breaking the getting started step down enough that it doesn't feel daunting. And I think this happens with New Year's resolutions. It happens with all kinds of goals. We're like, we have to make monumental strides and completely change my life. And we do it for a week and we're exhausted.
Yeah.
Um, so just, I think I'd love to talk about some potential steps. And also, like, I think the mindset is really important that we can have a lot of shame and a lot of like punishing ourselves around money. And that really stops us. So,
Mm.
as hard as it is, like, if we mess up or if the step doesn't go well, to kind of say, interesting, like, what happened here? What can I do better next time? And think of it as this, like, I wish I could say you arrive and it's done, but it's this this lifelong journey we're all on to continue and get better and better at this.
Right. So the first chapter of your book, it talks about what is a financial adult.
Yes.
Interesting. That's a question that I don't think I've ever heard asked before. So I love that. And like what would be the definition of a financial adult?
So how I define it are those kind of those 4 things where you're taking the steps, you know where your money's going, you have plans that you feel confident. And the whole point of having money, most of us are not motivated by having like just a stack. It's like what the stack of money gives you and allows you to have in your life. And so I think a great place to start is with goals
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
like, what do you want? And it can be tangible things like, and it can also be feelings and then breaking down what those feelings, what's behind those feelings. So if it's like peace of mind, that could be like, oh, the rainy day fund. That could be having a budget. And I think, budgets get a really bad rep. We think of them as like these.
It's like diet culture.
Exactly. But I found that as long as it's a loving budget, which I call them happiness allocations.
Oh, I love that.
I think it's a better name. It's how we allocate our money in the way that's going to make us the happiest in the short and long term.
Yeah.
That part is the long term part is key. Otherwise,
Yeah.
we'd have a different budget. But we can build in potentially things that are more frivolous and more fun and not feel guilty about them because we know that they're not getting in the way or we can afford them or that, there's enough money there for them. And so it can actually be really an act of self love versus a this thing we have to do.
I really love that perspective because you're right. I think a lot of the conversation around money is restriction, deprivation, delayed gratification. And it's almost just like, at what point do I actually get to enjoy this money? Because I don't necessarily want to wait until I'm like in a nursing home to be like, okay, we have permission now to like go and live my life. And I think what trips a lot of people up to is this comparison of just like,
Mm.
I need to be doing exactly what everybody else is doing and not taking into account your personal values, your goals, what do you want for your life. So I love that you start off with that. Do you have any like practical tips for how we can start to like visualize our goals? Are you like a journaler? Are you into like, putting affirmations all over the wall? Like what's your strategy?
In the book, there's an exercise that just like has us list things down that we want. And I think the strategy around the goals, so definitely listing out, and then there's like the prioritizing, because if we're putting money aside for too many goals, it can feel very not motivating because they're all like kind of inching up, but 10 goals are inching up. And
Mhm.
it's also hard to pick one or two goals. Like when you think about retirement's kind of a goal we're going to be always putting money aside for. So we can't just pick one. We got to, so I recommend like picking 2 to 5 goals depending. And a lot of it goes back to knowing ourselves and testing things out and seeing how it feels. Like if 2 is way too few or 5 is like I feel like I'm making no progress, we can adjust. And a lot of this is about adjusting. But I do think keeping our goals top of mind. So a few things that are really important with goals is being clear on them. So having them be smart goals. So they're specific, measurable, like if you actually achieve them, not like I'm making more money or I'm saving more. Um, they're in your control. So it's not like my husband will save more. um, and they're relevant. So you're pumped about them. They make you excited and they have a time limit to them. So time bound. And then keeping our motivation up. I think it's really interesting, the psychology of it. I've noticed it in all parts of my life, but as I get closer to a goal, it almost is like my brain makes it feel like it's not that exciting anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, this is where I started. It feels like you actually haven't made progress. And so I think it's really important to actually track your progress, because then you can see how far you've come. You can measure it versus our brain might be like, oh, I haven't really done much. Where was I? I've been this place this whole time. And I do like having pictures. I used to live in an apartment where I worked in the basement, and it was really dark. And, it was really great that I had that space to do it, but it was dark and freezing down there. And I would dream about having like a very bright office. And so I kept that, like I found a picture of an office and I put it in. I have a goal book where
Oh, I love
there's
that.
images in there. And even I probably could do more with it, but when I look back at the goal book, it's amazing to see how they happen.
Yeah, I love that. Visualization is super powerful. And I think it's just like a constant reminder of what you're working towards. That's really useful. Okay, so since you talk about kind of consumer activism and just being aware of, the greater systemic barriers that exist, one that is very apparent is the pay gap and
Mm,
the wage gap, especially for women of color. So that's one of the reasons why I talk so much about the power of side hustles and just like supplementing your income, because we're starting like behind the eight ball. What are your best tips around like earning more, side hustling, as somebody who was able to take this from a side hustle to your full-time job?
yes, that's a great question. And it's interesting because I feel like side hustle used to be this idea of like this extra money, and now it's sometimes needed, right? To even like pay the bills and have the lifestyle that you want. So I think even sometimes we think of side hustles as smaller than they are. And so I think my biggest tip would be to treat it like a business, to be the CFO of your side hustle, if you will. So a lot of the things that we do with our personal finances, we can also do with our business, like mapping out what we expect to earn, mapping out, and it can be, I think that plans are best if they're realistic but also optimistic. If they're too optimistic, then it can feel like we're failing all the time. But mapping out our income, mapping out our expenses with building businesses, one of the biggest pain points I see is not putting money aside for taxes. So I'm a fan of having a separate tax fund where, if even if you're paying your quarterly estimates, to have like figure out the percentage so that every check that comes in, money is going to that tax fund. I think too, like there's a section in the book on, definitely we cover in chapter 4, it's called All About Income, and we cover the wage gap. Like a lot of the things that need to happen to close it are higher level policy things and corporate policy. But one thing that we can do also is negotiate, and we can do it in our salary jobs. We can do it in our, like if we are in our side hustles, if we're working with clients. As much as I help other people negotiate, it is hard to negotiate for yourself. And so something that really helps me is thinking about how, when I ask for what I believe I deserve, or maybe what the market rate is, or better, what I think the market rate should be, is that I'm helping to close that gap, and I'm giving, maybe I will experience the double bind and get pushback, but I am kind of paving the way for other women to be able to negotiate. And that really can get you feeling motivated and revved up before before sharing your rate.
I really love that perspective. And so one of the things that I've coached women in who are, trying to build their side hustles is just like, please do not ask other women of color to do free labor for you,
Mm,
because then we're becoming the oppressors at that point. And so even if you can only afford to pay somebody like $50 for their time, $20, whatever, offering that income is just, it's going to make you just show up differently. It's going to make them show up differently, and it's going to help us be active participants in changing what's happening, right?
mm.
So I think that's just super important to like be cognizant of, that you're not perpetuating this cycle of unpaid labor for women, especially.
Yes, I love it. And the something you mentioned too about the consumer activism chapter. So I think of consumer activism as like using your money to support what you want to see more of in the world, and removing your money from what you want to see less of. And so
Mm,
what's really cool as a business owner or someone who's building a side hustle is you can instill those values in the way you mentioned, like we always pay women and women of color. That could be like one of the business values. And
yeah.
So we get to decide. That's like very powerful as the CEO of your business, that you get to create that mission and vision.
Absolutely. Okay, so another thing that you talk about in the book is early retirement or becoming work optional. And I feel like this is a very polarizing topic because some folks are just like, no, I don't want to live on rice and beans and save my money for like 10 years and then retire in my 30s. Some people are just like, there's a bunch of people who are claiming they're financially independent, but they're frauds because they still have businesses. So they're not actually retired. It's a love hate thing. I get it. It's very confusing. What is your thought on the fire movement at large?
Yes. So it was funny because the fire movement, I forget when it started, but at first, that's exactly what I saw, is like all these dudes eating beans. And I was like, that is not for me. I am staying far away from that. And I kind of like never engaged in the movement at all. Now I'm seeing more women and women of color doing it differently and retiring. Like, first of all, right, like retiring in at the retirement age is a huge accomplishment that many people don't achieve, no fault of their own. Honestly, it's like we have so many issues with retirement. So I think that also is daunting. It's like, I just want to retire. This whole retire early thing makes me even more stressed. And I do think that there's like that, the balance and the of living now, and the higher our expenses now and in retirement, the longer it will take us to retire potentially. So I think because it's such a murky, different for everyone thing, I'm excited about the new voices in that movement who are not as judgmental. It's not as like I'm wearing the same outfit and eating beans every day and doing it their own way. So I think it's kind of reviving the movement for me.
No, I hear you. If I never hear, Mr. Money Mustache ever again, I'll be happy. I mean, I'm just like, well, there's just so many more people to hear from at this point. Uh, let's also talk about the what I would argue is like one of the pinnacles of being an adult that many of us feel pressure to is this idea of buying a home.
Mm.
Now, if you've heard anything about my story, I have a very love hate relationship with real estate because my experience was not very positive and I was getting just a lot of pressure from family and my circle to be like, you must buy a home. You are over 30. What are you doing with your life? I did it. I was not financially equipped for the responsibility. I was not mentally equipped for the responsibility. And so, do you think that you can be a financial adult and not own a home? Like, is that a thing?
100%. Yes. I think, that's like one of the very misleading things about the quote unquote American dream.
Yeah.
Like, buy the home. And there is so much pressure. Like, you're not an adult. And it depends where you live. Like, in some places, it's so expensive to buy a home that a lot of people who are adults do not. But in some places, that's like the pressure is very strong, to put the roots down,
Yeah.
quote unquote again. And yeah, so I think there's this rent versus buy calculator that I love. It's on the New York Times and it has so many inputs. And if you are not planning to live in a home for a really long time, well, take a step back. The First of all, I think we view the cost of the home as just the down payment. And buying a home is so much more expensive than that. And if we just leverage the down payment as much as we can afford, we're going to feel really tight. And if something breaks, or there's just so many more expenses. There's closing costs, there's maintenance now, like you can't call the landlord, all of these things that we want to be prepared for financially. But then there are other things like, what are we going to do with the money if we didn't buy a home, right? If we're investing it in the market? What's happening to that home value? No, we can make a guess, but we don't really know. How long are we going to live in that home? Because if you're buying and selling quickly, you're absorbing all of those closing costs in a couple years, and that can make not financial sense. And of course, there are people who have more subjective reasons for wanting to own a home that makes them feel financially stable. So I think, of course, it's still a great goal, but this idea that you can't financial adult without owning your home, I think is complete bogus. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the fact that we're getting permission from someone like you to like take that pressure off. Because I think there's still just a lot of it's throwing money away, you're being irresponsible, like the only way you can build wealth is through home ownership. And it's like, no, not actually the case. And this is why it's important to have the diverse group of people that you get information from. So you're not just getting pigeonholed into one way of thinking about money. It's a very individual journey.
Very individual. And there's, yes, so many things to consider. And the beginning of the chapter is very much like, is it right for you to buy a home
Yeah, it's a
at
great
this
first
point?
question.
Right.
No one asked me that question. They're just like, you must do it. You must do it now. Uh, I don't recommend. Okay. So, one thing that I have confronted now in my 30s as a financial adult is this upper echelon, if you will, of money conversations when we're talking about things like insurance and estate planning. It just all feels very like bougie, pinkies up. Like, who the hell am I to be having these conversations? What the hell's a beneficiary? What are some things that we should be thinking about? Maybe even just like if you're in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, not typically ages you would think about things like death and generational wealth transfers.
Yes, I would say like tax planning, estate planning, insurance, those are like top level financial adulting for sure. Um, so there's a bunch of types of insurance, and I think there's some, there's some that we engage with our whole life, like health insurance. First, with any type of insurance, it's just you want to ask a ton of questions and know how people are getting paid. So I think that is really telling, and trying to understand. I think a lot of these things are complicated because that behooves the company selling you the product to not understand it. So a lot of questions are really important. I think estate planning does sound really bougie, like you have to have so much money to do it, but we all have an estate. And it's just like what we have and what we owe. And a will or an estate plan is essentially saying what you would want to happen to that if you were to die. And that could be a plan for if you have debt that would pass on after you, so that those that are your next of kin or who you want to leave things to are don't have to pay it on their own. Or even like, for example, with generational wealth transfer, something I learned a lot by writing these chapters, because it was funny. We have young kids. I had written a will and done some estate planning. And then after interviewing all these people, I was like, oh, I did this all wrong. I need to go back and do this again. Um, but but when you pass on a house or a home, let's say we pass it on to somebody, like they actually have to pay the mortgage now and the taxes. And so just, I think having these conversations, it could also be with having them with parents, like understanding their wishes as they get older and how we can protect them and support them how they want to, instead of waiting until it's a time where it's really urgent. And just knowing what they have planned, because I think that is something that a lot of us are concerned about. Is it should supporting my family be part of my financial plan if it's not already? If it is, what does that look like as they get older? And people even are deciding where to live based on that, how many rooms they need. And so while it's something kind of like retirement where there's a lot of variables we can't exactly know, like when we're going to die or what the market's going to do, or we can plan and make educated estimates about those type of things and have conversations, even though those conversations, I remember when we did our like guardians, which are the people who will take care of your children if something were to happen to you. I cried. You don't want to think about
Yeah.
that situation. And then once you pick, they're like, okay, now we need a backup. You're like,
Right.
I picked two. Um, so I really understand why people avoid the conversations, but in my interviews with the trust and estates attorney, Lori Ann Douglas, she shared that often people who estate plan are people who have experienced when someone else didn't.
Mm.
And it's
Mhm.
really the biggest gift, that when someone is mourning you or you're going through something with a loved one, that there's a plan and that there's not this huge headache.
Yeah. Yeah. When you put it like that, it really is such an important conversation to have because I think the last thing you want to be doing is dealing with a crisis. Somebody passes away unexpectedly. There's nothing, written down. And then, like, it can cause conflict with family and loved ones. And, like, who needs that when you're already dealing with, like, so much stuff?
Right.
And so, when it comes to being a financial adult, I think it's we also have to think about like when is the right time to start enlisting professional help, right? Like I don't think you necessarily need to maybe hire a professional to help you figure out a budget. Maybe you want to like contact a money coach or something like that. But at some point, you're going to have to start talking to like attorneys, maybe CPA if you have a business, maybe a certified financial planner. When should we start thinking about this stuff?
Yes, it's a great question. I think for some people it's right away because if you're not going to do things on your own and you need support in order to do them and you know yourself, like you want to be, for example, if you know yourself and you're never going to start investing unless you talk to a CFP or have a financial advisor, then it's important to have those conversations even if and regardless of who you hire, I think another really important point is you always want to know what's happening with your money. And that's a really important thing to get a vibe of in a conversation with a professional is that they're not going to kind of poo poo your questions and they will sit there and explain things to you. And you feel comfortable to really understand what's happening with your money, whether that's in your estate plan with an attorney, whether that's in your prenuptial agreement. That's another thing we talk about in the book is in relationships how to protect yourself. So if you're not married and you're living together, a cohabitation agreement. I interviewed an amazing divorce attorney about that, and Lauren Hunt. And if you are married, like how to protect your assets, because typically the woman is the one who gets screwed in the case of a divorce somehow, some way, every time. Um, So really thinking about protecting yourself is another big financial adulting thing. And Daisha Kennedy of the Broke Black Girls, she talks about the walkaway fund and having enough money saved so that if you needed to walk away at any point, because so many, I think it's 99% of abuse cases include financial abuse. And so to be able to have that protection to get up and walk away and not need to wait for court proceedings or transfer of funds, or which could take a long time and have you not be able to leave or have to build up credit card debt while you're waiting. So, a long tangent. So, I think there's different points for different things. But for example, like there's to buy insurance, you have to work with a broker, and it could be someone that it could be a digital broker online. I interviewed Jennifer Fitzgerald from Policy Genius for the book, and so that their system is all online to get life insurance. But these financial professionals are often needed in those points to create your prenup or your cohabitation agreement. It would be like depending on how complex and how many concerns you have, a meeting or a couple meetings with an attorney. And same for estate planning. There's some disability documents like your healthcare proxy and living will and power of attorney can all be done online. And there are services to create your will online, but the recommendation from those I interviewed was to talk to a professional for those as well.
Yeah, I don't recommend like trying to DIY legal documents. I just feel like there's just too many opportunities for you to screw up or create something that's like not even enforceable, doesn't even make sense. So I think it's just about kind of knowing where your area of expertise ends and not seeing that as a flaw somehow. Like just I think you must get used to this idea that as you get better with money, as you build wealth, you're just going to have to enlist financial professionals. And that's just part and parcel with the game.
And they pay off, I think. So I guess it's a really interesting question, like when it makes sense. And I think it's when you start to have questions or when you're
Mm,
like, or you're at dinner and your friend tells you about this great tax saving strategy they're using, and you're like, wait, I need to
what?
know about this. Yeah. Um, yeah. And I think too, I interviewed a few like financial planners for the book, and they work with people in different ways. Like depending on if you want to have someone you're able to call up all year round and talk about things, but sometimes it's like a meeting for a couple hours and you're set up for a few years and you're just good to go. So I think having questions or things you're concerned about is and as things get more complicated and grow is kind of a nice impetus to say, okay, maybe I should talk to someone and see. But always know how they're paid and always make sure that you feel like they'll be answering your questions and that you get along with them, honestly.
Yeah, they should definitely understand your goals, your unique, situation. And I love the fact that you said like, when things get complicated, because that's exactly when I started looking at, I need a CFP on retainer because I'm just like now helping my parents plan for retirement. I'm like, I don't even know what the hell you guys have So let's bring in a professional here because I don't want to necessarily screw this up. If you feel like you're just not qualified to handle whatever the situation is, don't be afraid to reach out to your network, find somebody that you trust, and have them kind of in your back pocket.
And it's kind of like a doctor, sorry to interrupt, but a
No, yeah, go ahead.
doctor would not see themselves, even though they know a
Mm,
lot. And I
mm-hmm.
think it was interesting. I interviewed people shared how they invest, which I thought was cool. Like what looking in at what they're doing with their investments, that is interesting to see investment professionals, what they're doing. And even people who are like the lead financial planner for a robo advisor use the robo advisor or have someone helping them, So
Yeah.
there's no shame in that, I think, at all.
Yes. So another thing that I love that you talk about in the book is this idea of being an investor for the greater good, not just investing necessarily for, returns and for the financial aspect of it, but actually using your money to potentially change the world. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So in the book, in that chapter, we talk about that's like investing outside of retirement. So how we invest our money in our brokerage accounts, and then we talk about, or I talk about it. I've collaborated with so many people on this book. I keep saying we, but really I wrote it. So um, the on ESG investing, and so that stands for environmental social governance. And there's ways to, I think there a key theme that came up over and over in my interviews on consumer activism, which is deciding what companies to spend our money with. And ESG investing is that it's not perfect, that we're like the system's flawed. And if you have too many criteria, there's going to be nothing left to invest in. But choosing things that are important to you, whether that's you want to invest with companies that have diverse boards and diverse management teams, or ones that are working to be more sustainable, or working on reducing like the harm to the planet. So you can screen for those type of things, and there are funds that do that. And there's also a tool at the MSCI tool that you can search and see how these companies stack up. And I think there'll be more and more um, of these funds because the demand is high. People are getting more interested in this and they care about where they're putting their money. And a cool part is that research has been showing that we're not really giving up returns by investing in these funds, because they're companies that are doing the right thing are often getting rewarded, or companies with diverse management are doing better. And so often it's this win-win.
Yeah, I love that. It's just you don't really understand the power that you have to change the world with money until you realize how much good you can do with it. So, I love that message. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about in the personal finance space is this idea of like the connection between your mental health and your overall financial health, which I don't think gets talked about enough, especially for marginalized communities, people of color. Mental health is still very much a stigma, and it does impact, everything about how we show up in the world. So have you done any exploration of that topic, and like what do you think the overall personal finance space could do better to make this
Mm,
like not a nuanced conversation? Because I don't really think it is. I think all of us have shit we're dealing with, and we're still trying to get our financial stuff together too.
totally. And like I think this has come to a head in this pandemic.
Oh, for
Like
sure.
we're all a mess right now.
Yeah.
And I like even lucky ones are a mess. So there's an interesting book, and so I think of it this two ways. And tell me if I'm completely taking what you're saying and moving on a tangent. But there's a book called Scarcity, and it talks about how not like this the not even the rat race, but like trying to make ends meet, like what that actually does to our brain and how that influences like how our brain works. And I think that it's really fascinating and it's really important. So I think that's how money can impact our mental health and just generally stress. Like money can lead to so much stress of not having it, and others from having too much of it. Sometimes that can lead to a lot of problems. Um, but also, I think it also is pretty interesting when people focus on their well-being. And right now, that could include like healthcare costs. It could include investing in mental health. It actually is really expensive to find.
Absolutely.
Therapists are expensive. Taking time off can be really expensive. Like investing in the things we need can be really expensive, and that's unfortunate. Prioritizing that and viewing that as worthy and valuable is really important for the personal finance community, I think, to talk about. Otherwise, if it's this idea like, it's all about saving and not using our money, and not prioritizing it on things that will improve our well-being, then that totally misses the mark because money is part of our well-being.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of like, people are recommending that folks who get COVID quarantine at home for 2 weeks. And I'm thinking of
Mm,
like a mom who's making minimum wage in a job that has no benefits cannot afford to do the thing that is quote unquote societally like responsible, right? So it's like we're
mm,
almost creating a society where people have to choose between their health and their money, and it's just so fucking toxic. And I think it just like we can't have conversations around money without realizing the greater systemic shit that needs to change, like providing a living wage, like providing paid maternity leave, like providing paid sick leave, like holding your politicians accountable for all the fucked up stuff that's going on in society. Like it's all connected. So it like frustrates me when I get comments that it's just like, why do you make this political? Why are you talking about? And it's just like, dude, money's political. I mean, point blank
yes.
period. I don't know why you're confused.
Yes. If the minimum wage has been 7.25 for the last 20 years and the prices of goods have gone up like 20 something percent,
In a
like
year.
you can't budget your way out of that,
No,
right?
you
Like,
cannot.
yeah.
Yeah.
And yes, paid leave. I think that was something that came up over and over again. Paid sick leave, paid and paternal leave, so parental leave, as like things that make it motherhood and is a huge part of the pay gap
Yeah.
and the wealth gap and the ability to take, especially like that really was, we saw a lot of that in the pandemic of people not being able to take time off when they're sick or getting and paid, and now they can't afford life, and then yeah,
Yeah.
it's a mess.
It is. And I think that the more we have these conversations, the more we can start to just make folks aware and have them start asking some of the harder questions of, greater society in general. So I'm wondering, like, as a financial adult, like, how do you know when you're done? Are you done?
I know, it's bad news, friends. You're never done.
Oh, damn it. All right. I knew that was coming.
But I think it's almost, it's kind of like the thing we talked about where like you thought when you got the title or the pay, you would feel like you made it. And it's you, I think when you have the opportunity to hit some big goals, you think this is all you've ever wanted, even when it's something that means a ton to you. It's not just like what someone told you should do. It doesn't fill you. And I think it's about like enjoying the journey and enjoying the mess ups, and as hard as that is, because even if I make my plan this year and it goes really great, like I don't know what's coming next year. I'll have a
Mm,
different, you got to just or things that were really important to me a couple of years ago and I love spending money on, I wouldn't now anymore. And now things shift. So I think for our money to reflect our values and to bring us the most joy, we need to keep in touch with it.
I love it. So, Ashley, for folks that want to find out more about you, get your book. It's called Financial Adulting, and it is releasing February 2022.
Yes. February 23rd, and you can get the book at financialadultingbook.com.
Amazing. And where can we follow you on social?
At the Fiscal Femme, FISCALFEMME.
That's fantastic. Are there ways that folks can work with you? Like, do you have programming, coaching, things like that that folks can find out more about?
That's a great question. So I have, my first book was the 30-day money cleanse. So that's another one very focused on budgeting, money mindset. So this, and it's definitely also a workbook, colorful, I think very fun to work through. And then this book is covering all the topics, bringing in a lot of other experts versus my first book was just from my perspective. And then I also have online courses, and you can find them on my website. There's right now there's 4 different ones that you can check out.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure to link all of those in the show notes. Thank you so much for making this space so much more inclusive, making the conversation much less broy and much more relatable. I appreciate all the work that you do. Thank you so much.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.